Thank you for joining us for the webinar today. This webinar is sponsored by the Institute on Disability and Human Development, the Leadership Education Neurodevelopmental Disabilities LEND program, both at the UIC's Department on Disability and Human Development, as well as TAP, the Autism Program of Illinois. Funding is provided in part by the Autism Program of Illinois and the Illinois Department of Human Services. We are really excited to have a great presenter with us today to share about this important topic. I will now turn it over to Jae Jin.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for being here today. As the name said, my name is Jae Jin Pak, and I'm very excited to be your presenter today. Next slide. Just a little background about me. I am the Community Education and Training Coordinator based at the Institute of Disability and Human Development at UIC. I also am connected with the Illinois LEND program. I identify as a person with multiple disabilities. I've worked in social justice for many years and around issues of mental health, trauma, gender-based violence, and disability awareness. And as part of that career journey, I've had the pleasure and the privilege of connecting with many disability leaders and colleagues and acquaintances and friends and mentors in the disability community. And we've had a lot of conversations around the topic of sexuality and disability. And I'm glad to be facilitating this conversation today about the intersection of disability and sexuality. Going over some information, some of the challenges, and then really talking about the importance of how to support individuals with disabilities in their journey to explore their own sexuality and relationships in a healthy and safe way, as well as talking about some resources. All right, so we can go on. So the first question I have for you, actually, and I'm going to ask and invite you to use the chat, is to answer this question: what comes to mind when you hear the words sex and disability? You can write like a couple of words or a short phrase. What phrases, ideas, thoughts pop into your mind when you hear the words or see the words sex and disability? Okay, we got some confusion. Any other thoughts? Fantastic. Birth control, unsafe, rights and responsibilities. Great, that's a great start. And it's an interesting from just that initial sampling of your thoughts. It covers areas of feelings and disability rights, of the importance of that being part of maybe the idea that sexuality is part of our disability rights movement. And confusion, there is a lot of confusion. That is true, and hopefully some of that we won't be able to eliminate all the confusion around sexuality and disability, but hopefully by the end of our hour together, you'll have some resources to help clarify some of the questions.
Jae Jin, there's a few more comments. Do you want me to read those aloud?
Oh, please.
Somebody said a normal part of life. Another person said sex is natural. So even people with disabilities will go through puberty and have natural urges and feelings. And one other person said uncertainty and education for the disabled persons.
Oh, these are great. Thank you so much for those. Thank you for that. And all of those ideas and perspectives are valid. As I mentioned, it is confusing. There is uncertainty in exploring sexuality. There is And as someone mentioned, it is also very much a natural part of who we are and of being individuals and being human and being part of our community. We'll kind of expand on some of those as we move along. So now asked to move on to the next slide. So in a lot of conversations, in some conversations, I also ask this direct question, really, why is it important to discuss sex and disability? And the blunt question is, if we can go to the next slide, is that people with disabilities are having sex. It is a very direct and very clear message, and it's very true. Something that I've experienced, and in conversations with mentors and colleagues and friends of mine in the disability community over many years, from when I was a young adult into my 50s, where I am now. There's, in the disability rights and justice and services conversations, there's a lot of conversation around access to education, access to employment, independent living, and healthcare, and equality and equity and fairness, and all of that is very important, very real. But there hasn't been a lot of conversation in terms of the rights and the importance for us in the disability community to explore and learn about personal relationships, our friendships, our intimate relationships of dating and sexuality. And just because we don't talk about it doesn't mean it doesn't happen. The reality is, as it's very clearly shown in text and in the images on the screen, and there's a graphic on the screen of a kind of a black rectangular background, and there's 8 images of representations of someone, the graphic of the disability image of the person in a wheelchair, along with another graphic person, and they're posed in various sexual positions. And again, this is just a very direct way of acknowledging the reality that people with disabilities are having sex and have real sexual desire and feelings. Again, which is an important just fact to recognize. Next. So, having said all that, there are some important kind of basic realities, and that's true for all of us human beings, that people with disabilities are people. We are part of the human race like everybody else. And as human beings and as people with disabilities have the full range of emotional expression and have that potential and that capacity. That people with disabilities have the full range of gender expression. That people with disabilities, like everybody else, has the possibilities of being cisgendered male, identifying as female, as bisexual, transgender, gender neutral, having their own, having a unique definition of how they identify their gender identity, the whole spectrum of gender expression, and every part of that. People with disabilities are not exempt or are not excluded from that, because we are human beings with a full range of emotional and sexual and gender expression. People in the disability community can identify with any gender identity that's out there, and that's perfectly normal. Similarly, with people with disabilities, have the full access to the full range of sexual expression and sexual orientation. So people within the disability community, like everybody else, has the capacity and the potential of being asexual, to straight and heterosexual, gay, trans, bi, and questioning, pansexual, whatever the different identities under the sexual expression spectrum is, people with disabilities have the opportunity and the potential of being any part of that sexual expression spectrum. And again, I share this and I make a point of this conversation because the disability community, as I'm sure many of you are aware of, and if you think about it, over the history, people with disabilities are a marginalized community. As a marginalized community, there's a lot of negative stereotypes or imaging or messaging or perceptions around it. And one of the key messages or perceptions that is shared amongst any other marginalized community is the systematic dehumanization or othering of us. And one of the ways that people with disabilities are othered is the removal of our gender identity, sexual expression, ability to our intellectual abilities, and just kind of boiling it down to the disability, whatever the disability limitations are. And forgetting that we are human beings with a full level of emotional expression, gender expression, sexual expression, and the full range of intellectual expression. People with intellectual developmental disabilities, the way they process information, communicate their information may be different, but they still have the ability to process and reason and think through and make choices for themselves and express. And the way that they express their decisions or their ideas may be different, but they still have that potential within them as part of being human, as part of being a person. And it is the whole person that is important to recognize, and that sexuality is one aspect of it. And which is why I also make the point on the slide. The reality is that it's important to hold these to be true for all people, and not to minimize, diminish, or separate any of these truths because the person happens to be someone who identifies as having a disability. Their disability does not negate their emotional expression or their gender identity or their sexual expression or their intellectual processing. It doesn't remove it, doesn't negate it, doesn't invalidate it. It just means that the way that they interact or express their emotions, relationships with people may be in a different way than what historically has seen as traditional able-bodied communication or venue or traditionally able-bodied communication styles. Okay. But again, just the bottom line of this is that we're people. And I know I'm kind of harping on this, but it is a really important truth that is important to keep in mind. Next. So just to, and I'm sure many of you already have heard these stereotypes. For the next couple of slides, I'm just going to try to go over some of the barriers. And stereotypes and myths are big challenges. We in the disability community have a long history, again, as I mentioned, of being marginalized and dehumanized and minimized. And some of the common messages around that we have been socialized, that people have told us with very clear, direct, explicit messaging or subtle messaging have been the ideas that people with disabilities are asexual, or that people with disabilities are hypersexual. Because of a person's disability, they can't control their sexual urges and are potentially dangerous or can't control what they do. People with disabilities don't need to know about sex, because people with disabilities, it's wrong for people with disabilities to be sexual, or people with disabilities aren't sexy. Who would want to date someone or be intimate or be romantic with a disabled person, or whatever that disability may be? There has been a strong messaging over decades and generations that people with disabilities are unattractive, are unlovable, and don't deserve or don't need sexuality information, because no one is going to want to be sexual with a person with a disability. As well as the message, people with disability, if you're disabled, you shouldn't be having sex anyway. Because there's this notion that sex is supposedly a privilege or an activity for, quote unquote, the able-bodied or normal society. And because for many, many years, and even today to some degree, there are attitudes and perceptions that people with disabilities are abnormal. And because we're abnormal, we should not be allowed or given access to sex ed information. Similarly, there's also messaging of disability are childlike. There, again, for many years, I remember thinking back when over the course of my life, when people have discovered that I was disabled, there were many instances in interactions when I felt that the person shifted their perception and how they interacted with me as someone like a child. And if you see a grown adult with a disability as childlike, the way that person communicates respect or information is going to be very different. And if society sees us as disabled people as childlike, well, children don't need to know about sex because they're not going to have sex, so why tell them? People with disabilities have more important things to worry about, like work, like independent living, like going to school, education, those kind of productive parts of life. And yes, advocating for equal access, equal fair and equitable treatment and respect, and being seen as people in the community, and productive contributors to society is important. Having the right and fighting for our right to be employed and going to school is all valid and important, but so is our personal life. The exploration and the growth and the development of our personal relationships, of friendships, of romantic feelings. Again, because we're people, we have sexual desires and sexual attractions. We want, like every other human being, want to explore that. And if society has the message, you have more important things to worry about, we're not going to prioritize sex ed information, that lack of knowledge is potentially very dangerous. Talk about some of the risks in a little bit. Additionally, the stereotypes and the myth that people with disabilities don't understand consent. Again, because society may have this perception that because a person's disability, if it's a communication disability or a mental health condition or a developmental intellectual disability, they may jump to the wrong conclusion that that person doesn't understand consent, because the way that they process information and communicate is different from what society has deemed normal. And that is very, very wrong. People with disabilities, again, are able to understand and learn and communicate consent or refusal. It's a matter of taking the time to learn the accommodation and learn the communication style that works for the person. Just like people who speak a different language, you take the time to learn the language or set up a translator so that you can communicate. And again, this idea that people, the next line, the next myth about people with disabilities don't get sexually abused. Oh, go back, please. About the notion of people with disabilities, because there's also this notion in society that I've also experienced and observed, is that people with disabilities are somewhat protected by able-bodied society, or that people with disabilities need to be protected, that because they're protected, they're not going to get abused or assaulted. That's incredibly wrong. The reality is that people with disabilities and disability community are anywhere from 2 to 7 times the greater risk of sexual victimization than able-bodied individuals. And this is proven out by multiple studies and reports over many years, years in different studies. So that's a blatant misperception, and it also goes to the importance of acknowledgement of education and awareness of sexuality. Because you're aware and you have the information and the language that will help lower the risk. And we'll talk about some of that in a little bit. And the last line about people with disabilities shouldn't have children, again, goes back to the whole idea of disability is abnormal and it's wrong or strange for people with disabilities to be parents or sexual. When in fact, I know many people in the disability community who are amazing, loving parents and have really healthy, loving relationships. I know many folks in the able-bodied community whose marriages and relationships fallen apart. Being able-bodied doesn't guarantee healthy relationships or a good home life or a good family life. And it is not fair to make that assumption against or hold that assumption against the disabled community because of their disability. People with disabilities span the entire spectrum. And enough of that. So next, let's talk about some systemic challenges. So there are, in our society, in the US, for a long time, and we continue to have a really healthy debate around access of comprehensive sex ed. It is important to think about the value of sex education. I'll talk about some of the components of that in a little bit. Some of the other barriers is family dynamics. Not every family in our society is a loving, healthy, close relationship. And even in loving, healthy, close relationship families, not every family member is comfortable talking about sex with their siblings or with their children. And that's just the nature of family dynamics. In my family personal history, I know my parents love me, my sisters and my brothers love me and care for me, but it was, talking about sex ed and sexuality wasn't something that was very easy for us to do. Like many families, some families it comes naturally and it's easier, some families it's not. By nature of that can be challenging for folks with disabilities to learn about sex. As well as cultural values. And some of that goes back to some of the misconceptions that we talked about. Societal attitudes around people with disabilities. As long as society has a tendency to see us as different, that influences how society sees us. And in many cases, if it's different, which is negative, we're lowered on the priority of accessing information like comprehensive sex ed. Okay. Having said all of this, let's move on to some solutions or some opportunities for support. So let's talk about, next slide. let's talk about sex ed. I said, we've had this long debate about comprehensive sex ed. In this context, sexual development, there are some very objective things about sex ed and about the human body and anatomy that is important for people to learn. And again, learning about sex ed, one of the realities is, going back to what I mentioned earlier regarding some of the truth about being people, is that sexual development is natural. It is a normal, natural part of human development. Understanding, getting accurate information about sex ed and sexuality, it promotes positive body image. It promotes self-confidence. I know what my body parts are, what they're called, I know what my eyes and my knees and my legs, I know what their function is. I also know, in terms of sex ed, I know, the proper name to call a penis or a vagina or breasts, and what those functions are and what the boundaries are. Understanding, empowering an individual with a disability, or someone, just anybody with or without a disability, the basic understanding of their body, what it's called, what the different body parts are functioning, and helping them understand what the boundaries are, how their body relates to other people and other situations and the environment around them, between private parts and public parts and those kinds of things. Again, helps build confidence, helps build self-image. It facilitates healthy relationships. If they understand what their, the concepts of healthy sexuality and boundaries in between public parts and private parts, and an understanding of sexual attraction, they're in a better position to, when they start to explore dating and relationships and intimacy and sexual activity, with that information, they're in a better position to think about and choose for themselves what boundaries and what they're comfortable with. And reduces the likelihood of guessing, or reduces the likelihood of falling under peer pressure in situations where they may feel uncertain. And with comprehensive sex ed, with that very clear understanding of what body parts are, what they're called, their relationships and boundaries and consent information, with that information, it can reduce the risk of sexual victimization. It won't get rid of it. There unfortunately isn't anything that's 100% guaranteed, but that knowledge, that clear information about their sexual identity and their sexuality, and boundary conversations, and what their rights are over their own body, and their ownership and autonomy over their own body, can help a person with a disability set boundaries, communicate their choices to their partner, their date, so that they can be an active partner in forming and shaping how their relationship or how that date goes, without feeling like they have to comply with the date. Okay. So that's the power of having a really good positive access to sex ed, accurate, and I underline accurate sex ed information. Okay. So let's move on to the next slide. So one of a really positive piece of legislation that got enacted into law last year is HB 3299, which is now enacted as a law, public law, or Public Act 101-0506. This piece of legislation was enacted into law, and it came into being because of a lot of advocacy and a lot of work from the disabled community, from self-advocates with intellectual and developmental disabilities, as well as allies, really pushed for this law. And this piece of legislation basically says that adults with intellectual or developmental disabilities who are receiving services from a day program or community living program, and who want to learn about and have access to sex ed information, accurate, comprehensive sex ed information for healthy relationships and dating, that provider is now required to facilitate that knowledge and help them find those resources. Okay, so we can go to the next slide. As a result of this law, over the past year, there has been a partnership with the Guardianship Office, representatives from the Illinois Department of Human Services and DHS, self-advocates from the disability community, and other experts around developing a curriculum and reviewing a curriculum around sex ed, and also accessibility and accommodations, have been working, have formed a working group. It is called the Sexual Education Working Group. And they've been working for the past year, and they've developed a couple of committees. There's the curriculum committee, which has worked to review to date about, I think, 7 or 8 different curricula from across the country that has information around sexuality for people with disabilities. That committee has vetted them for content, found that for the most part, those curricula have accurate, comprehensive information, are disability accessible, and those curriculum are going to be available to providers to review, as well as self-advocates and allies and families to review as well. There's also a policy committee that has worked, that works closely with policymakers, as well as providing guidance to help organizations look at their policy and procedures and internal operations, so that organizations are getting assistance in how to support the self-advocates they're serving, so that when these questions come up about where can I live, and organizations can think about and plan how developing protocols and procedures to support the individuals that are living in community living to, again, safely, appropriately date and explore relationships while in those situations. Okay, so there is a lot of work and a lot of positive steps in this over the past couple of years in really recognizing and respecting the reality that adults with disabilities really have, we really have a need and a want to connect with other people, to date, to be intimate, to be sexual. And with the passage of this legislation, with Public Act 101-0506, really is a big step in supporting, recognizing, and supporting that part of our identity, saying that yes, we have rights to learn about this about sex and explore that, and there is no shame in that. Having sexual feelings, wanting to express have a person wanting to express their sexual attraction in and of itself is not shameful, it's perfectly normal. If that person, throughout their education from elementary school, developmentally through high school and through adulthood, is given appropriate information about their body and about sexuality, about helping them formulate boundaries and conversations, and that will help them in adulthood as they explore adult sexual relationships and relationships, them really have a healthy, safe, and enjoyable relationship where sex is part of that. And it removes the shame, and which I think there is also a tendency in our society to think of sex as being shameful or bad for folks with disabilities, when in fact, again, just part of being normal. Next slide. So in the last few slides, I just want to go back to this idea of what sexual rights are. And, you know, for families, for providers, and for allies of people with disabilities, it's important to know and see these rights too. And these the sexual rights that you see on this slide and the next slide were developed by self advocates, and they called it the Sexuality Bill of Rights. And there's also a YouTube video that is linked later on in the presentation. But you know, the key idea is that people, the key rights under this bill, under the Bill of Rights, is that that people with disabilities have the same inherent sexual rights as other adults. Again, because we're people, we're all human beings, and we have the same access and the same rights. Have the right to have a loving relationship and to explore that. Have the affirmation as a sexual being. Like all human beings, we are sexual, you know, sexuality is part of who we are in different degrees, but it is sexual identity and sexual expression in some way, shape, or form is part of what makes us human beings. That we have the right to exercise choice regarding sexual expression and relationships. That individuals with disabilities still deserve the respect and of hearing and respecting their choices regarding their sexual expression, sexual journey, sexual exploration and development of the relationships. Just because, you know, think back to when we were young, or parts of our life when we were involving in a relationship, and maybe our friends, our family disagreed. Whether it be romantic relationships, friendships, professional decisions, disagreements with family and friends around some life choices is part of our life. It's part of our history, a part of our makeup. That's also true for people with disabilities. Loved ones, friends, family members with the best intentions can disagree with a person with disability's choice. But unless the choice is inherently and immediately dangerous, aside from those emergent crisis situations, it's important to respect that person, especially around and in terms of sexuality and gender identity. If the person comes out and discloses that they're gay, trans, bi, asexual orientation, or gender identity, that allies and loved ones may be confused about, uncertain about, or may have a bias against, it's still important to think about it, but not to shame them. Because being gay, being straight, being bi, being trans, identifying as pansexual or bisexual, or not using different gender pronouns is perfectly normal, and it's okay. And it's not shameful or wrong. It's just different. And it's important to respect individual disabilities choices in this regard. Okay, next. Some additional rights is that people with disabilities have the right to engage in consensual sexual expression. Again, they can explore in safe, healthy ways, consensual ways, different sexual expressions and activities. As long as there's consent and reasonable safety is involved, it's important to kind of support a person's journey. Similarly, it's a right to say no. It's important to empower people with disabilities that they have a right to say no. Something that I can reflect on from my personal history, and again, that I've heard from anecdotally from my colleagues and friends in the disability community, is that many of us have been in subtle ways gotten the message we need to just go along with our doctors or therapists or other providers' recommendations. And we really, because our providers and doctors and nurses who prescribe things, treatments, activities, and whatnot, have the best things, we really shouldn't question that. And I can appreciate some of the positive intent from that, but the reality is that we as human beings have the right to question, and we can disagree. And again, aside from emergent life-threatening or crisis situations, providers and family need to respect that. We have the right to say no. And then also have the right to access sexual education around sexuality and information around sexuality, including reproductive health, that women and men have the right to learn about, if I want to become a dad, what's involved with that? For women, women with disabilities who want to become pregnant and want to have babies, they have a right to have access to all the accurate, correct information to help them and inform them, help them make informed decisions on what that's going to be like, and how being pregnant and getting pregnant may impact their body, including and what their disability and how their disability will be influencing all of that. They have a right to know, and with that knowledge can make afterwards. Right to privacy. People with disabilities have the right to privacy about our sexuality. That not to have questions about who they're dating or who they're seeing or what they're learning. Providers do not need to know sexual information unless there is a real legitimate reason. And even in those situations, the individual with disability still has a right to say, no, I'm not going to tell you. Mind your own business. It's my private business. Like, we all really value our privacy, especially around our sexual identity. We all hold that very privately. It's the sharing that respect with individual disabilities. As well as the, be free from discrimination and excuse me, to be free from discrimination, exploitation, and retaliation regarding sexual expression or the assertion of our sexual rights. And people with disabilities have the right to own their sexuality. And if providers, community members, individuals, or society at large has no business discriminating or passing judgment, because that's not. And it's important to remember these as part, again, going back to that core idea that we're all human beings. Next. So again, just a basic idea that I would like all of us to walk around with from this conversation is that sexuality is normal, and healthy sexuality is good. Sexuality is enjoyable. It's fun. There's a lot of positivity around the idea of a healthy sexual relationship. And it's a good thing. And that's okay to acknowledge. Next. So let's talk, I want to talk about some resources. There is, as you know, as I mentioned earlier, you know, the whole field of sexuality and body and disability, there's a lot of there is a fair amount of information, and it's complicated. So some books that are good touchstones that have some good information is there's and several of these books were written or co-authored by individuals with disabilities themselves. So Sex and Disability, The Ultimate Guide to Sex and Disability are really good books written by people with disabilities, sharing experiences and sharing their perspectives as a disabled identity person and their relationship with sex. And the books have some additional information as well. The book Already Doing It by Michael Gill, who has some additional information and also some good references in it as well. Next. So some additional resources and websites that have some educational information is there's a series of books that was called the Healthy Books for Boys and Girls Toolkit. Those are some good starting reference points for folks who want to have starting to explore and engage sexuality information. There's the website around sexuality across the lifespan, again, has some really good information. Something I want to mention is specifically around the concern around sexual victimization. There's the Illinois Imagines Toolkit. Illinois Imagines was a statewide initiative that helped to address and reduce sexual victimization, sexual violence, and people with disabilities. And as part of that work, developed a series of training modules, educational modules, and some of those modules had really good, comprehensive, accurate sex ed information that is geared for, I would say, young adults to adults. And those modules are available in English, Spanish, and then there's other additional supportive material as well. And some YouTube videos that I want to reference is to acknowledge and kind of bring of note is there's a couple of videos. The top two, My Voice, Sexuality, Self Advocacy, and Sexual Self Advocacy, are two videos that are roughly about 5 to 10 minutes each that were done by self advocates talking again, hearing from self advocates in the disability community about what our perspectives are, what our beliefs are, what our wants are, what we think is important for us to learn about sexuality, sexual rights as individuals. Another really good resource is, I think a couple of years ago, the National Council on Independent Living put out a video series, 10 video series called Sex Ed for People with IDD or Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities. Video is about 5 minutes, and each video features presenters, a diverse group of individuals from the disability community addressing things of consent, contraception, birth control, sexual boundaries, and healthy sexuality and healthy relationships. And these can be really good, useful videos to as conversation starters. Help those of us with disabilities learn about sexuality and with information for providers, for allies, to view these, again, to get some ideas and help give ideas on how to have a conversation with a friend or individual with disability around sexuality. And yeah, so thank you very much. If you have questions, I'm here. So again, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jae Jin. Yes, we have a few questions and comments, and I encourage people to feel free to type into the chat box if you have, or the Q&A box, either one, if you have any questions. I wanted to read a comment from our participant that I think it was when you were talking about the sexual rights and sharing those PowerPoints. We had a participant say, also people with disabilities have a right to representation in sexual media. There have been cases here and abroad that porn inclusive of disability, particularly amputee using nubs for penetration, as obscene. Disabled bodies are not obscene. So thank you for that comment. And
yes, thank you for that. That's very true.
We also had a participant that had some additional resources that I shared with everyone in the chat box.
Thank you for that.
And we have another question that says, I have had an advocate refuse to aid a client who requested a goal to look into and save for sex reassignment surgery because his choice was wrong and immoral. The client withdrew the request and stopped discussing it at their team meetings. I offered the client the option to request a new advocate, and the client turned it down, said he will always have that issue. He also dealt with depression for not being accepted. What's the best way to handle situations like that?
That is it's an unfortunate situation. Generally, my suggestion, it is important for providers in staff meetings and whatnot, in those kinds of situations, supervisory meetings, to really be clear with what their role is in supporting individual disabilities, and really encourage and support and help staff acknowledge and separate their own personal belief systems and imposing them inadvertently or directly on their client. As I mentioned, that person has every right to look into gender reassignment surgery. It's perfectly normal and acceptable, and there is no shame. And it is important, and it's unfortunate unfortunate for that individual with disability, because now they feel, as a result of that, I'm sure, with that feeling that they are now abnormal, weird, immoral, and that is just wrong. If you continue to have contact with that individual, if you can, just kind of in little ways, ordinary interactions, help them understand that their question and their desire to explore that is normal. It's okay. It's not shameful. That the message of being immoral was a mistake, and that keep the door open and let them know that, maybe you or other staff are open to have respectful conversations and help them explore that, providing and supporting their confidentiality and privacy to the best, to the extent you can, but helping them, really acknowledging that.
That's very helpful. And I just want to say there was one more resource put into the chat box for everyone. And now I'll turn it over to Anam to conclude our session today.
Jae Jin, thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. We had a lot of great comments, a lot of great resources that were shared. There was a lot of interest in this topic as well. We invite you to join us for our next webinar on February 24th at 12 p.m. Central Time, Employment, Advocacy, and Engagement. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Thank you so much, Jae Jin, for your wonderful presentation today. You can register at accessibilityonline.org/IDHD/schedule. Thank you, everyone.